So without much further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Steve Haines, today, who also happens to be a UCL alumnus, and we're delighted to welcome him back to UCL today. Steve is a campaigner and activist and co-author of How to Go to Work, the honest advice that no one ever tells you at the start of your career. Over the past year, he's spoken to over 1,000 students starting out in their careers, sharing the honest advice he's gathered from conversations with over 100 professionals and reading many Harvard Business Review articles. So Steve, it's over to you. I will stop sharing our screen at this end, and then if you can share your screen, and without much further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Andy, and delighted to be talking to UCL alumni like myself again. And the talks that I've been doing over the past 18 months now, actually, started with exactly one of these talks, right in the height of the pandemic, you may remember, the second lockdown. I'll tell you a bit about the book and about what I've been doing since, and I really hope that this is the kind of honest, practical advice you would find useful. I hope you are all joining from an equally enjoyable hot summer's day. So I'm enormously grateful for you taking some time to be joining this seminar when you could be out sunning yourself. Maybe some of you have innovatively combined both, and I'm on your mobile somewhere in a nice park. This is supposed to be a guide, a set of suggestions. I'm learning all the time, and I hope you all find it useful. But do put your thoughts and your comments in the chat box. I'll be asking you some questions as we go. So as interactive as you can make it, I hope it's helpful to you. A lot of this is written about the start of your career, and I'll explain why in a minute. But actually, a lot of it will hopefully be useful to career changes. One of the interesting things I found talking to careers centres is often the careers officers go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So I should apply that to my career. So this is all helpful stuff. And it's all gathered from, as Andy mentioned, a lot of insight from a lot of the business literature you don't always get to see unless, like me, you're slightly geekily interested in that particular world, and from conversations with real employers and people at the start of their career as well. So it's all gathered from that direct insight. I shall share my presentation because it's just going to structure some of my thoughts today as we go through it. But as I say, any point you want to stop me, have another conversation, and by all means, and I love this bit actually, follow up with me. My LinkedIn is Steve Haines 101. Come and ask me some questions, advice, thoughts, make suggestions. I really love to hear from you. This is a project I do with real passion and belief that we can make work a better place for those starting out and maybe make some stronger career decisions as we go. So I'm going to just share this presentation. You have a little look at this, right? Can everyone see this? You can give me a quick nod in the chat or a wave to say that you can see the presentation in front of you. Great, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Teresa. Fantastic. Let's start then with this. So wonderful quotes, which really started off this project to explain to you why I'm doing it. This is from a good friend, Poppy, who was 24 at the time she said it. She's a brilliant illustrator and started out in a career in illustration and kind of interest in architecture. I think her parents were GPs. And this is a really common experience for when you're starting out in work. It certainly was mine, which is that all I had was what my parents told me, and they were wrong. The reality is that most people, as their primary reference point for their career decisions, start with their parents or their caregivers, and they start with their teachers or their university lecturers, and they're often operating their thinking on the basis of quite a lot of wonky baggage that comes from these conversations, experiences from 20, 30, 40 years ago, a world of work that doesn't exist anymore and certainly isn't going to exist in the future, and maybe a bit of a limited view of what careers are out there, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, but not necessarily the supply chain consultants, not necessarily people who do jobs like me, which is kind of social impact funding, public affairs work. You know, this kind of nuance is really lost. And just to say a bit about me and why this is really relevant to me, I grew up in South Bristol at the end of the 1980s. My dad was an electrician. He worked in a factory. My mum was a home economics teacher. And I, from a very young age, was fascinated by the worlds of campaigns and social impact and policy making, in particularly around education. And that's how I came to UCL. I did an education policy master's at what was then the Institute of Education, and is now part of UCL. And it opened my mind. But I remember coming to London literally with my pack on my back, in the manner of Dick Whittington, turning up at Paddington Tube and going, what am I going to do? I was fortunate enough to kind of find my way into a think tank by being useful about writing some policy papers they needed some work doing on. Interestingly, and this was not planned at the time, some first destinations data about leavers from universities and graduate surveys and what they did next. And then my career developed into government. I worked in big charities for a while. I worked at the UN for a bit. I've worked all over the world. I worked in Rwanda for a while. And it's been a fascinating career, but I really didn't know what to do right at the start of it. And I'm having this conversation about this kind of, making my way through, and got to the conversation with Lucy, my co-author, who similarly went into advertising, and she ran a fashion social enterprise for a bit. And her dad was a school photographer, one of those guys who takes the long photograph of all the kids lined up, and similarly didn't really have the advice that she needed. And you'll find some of Lucy's hilarious stories about starting out at work in the book. Here it is. I'll just keep a copy close by. But the other thing we found was that all the people we were supporting at the start of their career were asking some of the most basic questions. You can go online and you can find out how to write a great CV, and that's in the book. You can get some interview advice. But actually, the questions were, what should I wear on a Zoom call? How do I ask for a pay rise? What about kindness and allyship and discrimination at work? And how do I manage those horrible situations where my boss is driving me up the wall and I'm having a terrible day and I'm crying in the loos? And that's one of the chapters, crying in the loos and other hideous realities. We wanted to tell the nuts and bolts about work. We wanted to tell what day one looks like, what week one looks like. And so we started writing it. And as you can see, it's quite a thick volume now. During the pandemic, when I was talking to the UCL alumni office, I was really worried that actually what was happening on the one hand was a real change in the nature of work, but on the other hand, some real challenges in terms of confidence, in terms of a sense of agency, in terms of making good career choices amongst all of the graduates that I was speaking to, and maybe some of those alumni as well, thinking differently about their careers. So it's kind of worrying and exciting. And I started giving talks like this to universities across the country. As Andy said, I've spoken to about 1,000 graduates, students, career changers, and hopefully with this helpful stuff. So this is a bit about what I'll be going through today. And what you're getting is a bit of a potted version of lots of different considerations as we go. What we'll be covering today then, a guide to the practical, often unspoken rules of work, understanding workplace culture, how it's formed, and how to decode it a bit, what culture is, the everyday expectations of contracts, workplace policies, the stuff that you won't find any helpful blogs about, the link between behaviours at work and perceptions of performance, and how to make sure you get what you need, including how to ask for pay rises and promotions, a mystery to me until very recently. So let's have a look at this. Congratulations, you've got the job. Now what? Well, this is a lovely quote from a friend of mine, David Skinner. He's done some fascinating jobs. He was the country director for Save the Children in Afghanistan. He's an amazing kind of thinker in terms of education, and he worked in the civil service in terms of the Hong Kong-China relationship for a while. And he says this brilliant quote, "My favorite time in any job is the time between being told I've been appointed and day one, because this is what's happening." This is taken from the hype cycle, if any of you know about kind of technology and the kind of theory behind that. You've got expectations and you've got the time, and you're being appointed to your new role and your expectations are, well, nowhere. You haven't really thought about it yet. You've gone through the interview process. But as you do that, your expectations get higher and higher. You convinced yourself into it. This is a wonderful move. You've gone from this terrible place that you were, or maybe just were banging your head against the ceiling in terms of your old job, or you've finished university and you're starting out anew, and your expectations go up and up and up and up about what this wonderful world would be. And then you start, and on day one and week one, you find that there's some of the same old problems, that there's some stuff that you're feeling worried about and concerned about, and you get this trough of disillusionment. And this usually happens in kind of weeks 3, weeks 4, as it starts to stretch out in front of you that this is another job which is going to have some of the same challenges. But with a good manager, with a good organizational culture, and with your enthusiasm, you can get to that slope of enlightenment and into your plateau of productivity where you're really settled and thriving in your job. And Andy and I had a great conversation about this when we were setting up this seminar. How do you do that? Well, one of the things to bear in mind is that employers, this is a lovely book actually by Michelle Hussein, the presenter, called The Skills. I really recommend it. And she says, employers and peers can make very swift decisions about the value you represent and what you bring to the role. But your aim, sorry for the typo, should be to establish positive credentials, even for just one thing. So the first bit of honest advice is get known to be good at one thing, make a good first impression, and that will carry you with pretty much everything else you do. Because what we need to look at is the culture of a workplace as a whole. You're not just doing an assignment and getting marked on it like you might have done at university. You're not even doing some group work on a practical, but you're trying to incorporate yourself in the culture of an organization. And that isn't just about beanbags, football tables, free snacks at the canteen, if you're lucky enough to get them. It's not about the bricks and mortar. It's about the people in that organization. So here's my first question to you. This is a list of things that you might admire and things that culture's built on. And I'd like you to put in the chat, have a look at this list, 3 things that you value. Maybe you're somebody who likes real clarity in work and you like a clear sense of authority. Maybe you enjoy a bit of challenge. You're somebody who's quite competitive. Maybe you really want to get meaning in work and see what your values are. Or maybe it really matters to you that you get honesty. So I'm going to give you a minute. Start to write in the chat your 3 things. Thanks, Pfizer. Creativity, 100%. Lovely thing to have. What else? Respect, belonging, justice. Lovely stuff, Yasmin. Thank you. Vision. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Something you always ask for. Challenge, intelligence, freedom. I love that. Respect, equality, and harmony. Belonging, creativity, and excellence. Belonging, I really care about a lot in terms of equality, in terms of respect for individuals. That really matters a lot. And I like excellence there as well, Sarah. I think there is something about one of the things I learned as a manager was if you create a high expectations culture within an organization, it can be hard work, but it's much more fulfilling. I like Teresa's stability. Really interesting thing. My dad was an electrician. He worked, as I mentioned, he worked in that factory for 40 years. He was rocked the moment that he was made redundant and that factory closed. It had a huge impact on him because what he valued was stability. And those kind of long-term jobs are there. They're rarer. They're hugely important. And I'd really recommend before you start a new role, when you're in that kind of, you're going up to that kind of point between the peak and the trough, think to yourself, what are the things I value? And maybe even when you're selecting where you want to work, think about, are those values really embodied by the organization I'm going to work for? And I do a session which looks at your values, your expectations, the outcomes you want to deliver, your personal interest, and tries to match them up to the organization you're going to work for. So bear those in mind. Keep a note of those, and thank you for all of these wonderful examples. I love that Zoe and Hermes, we've got lovely stuff about trust in there as well. Brilliant. Hugely important things. Those are your guiding lights on the kind of organization you want to work for. Because this is what's happening, and it's complex when you go into an organization. A lot of expectations from different parts of the organization about what you're going to be able to deliver on all at once. And you might have a job description, but it's likely to be quite loose. It won't be a series of exact tasks. It will be all of the different things that are kind of expected of you. So think about this, and you can plan around this. Incidentally, it's a great little framework, and I'll share these slides if you're interested to write out in advance. There's a bit about kind of planning your first 100 days, which is quite interesting as well, and what you want to do at each stage. But before you go into any new role, write out your answers to these questions. Let's think about you at the centre and what you want to get out of this. It's tempting going to a new role and think, right, how can I deliver for everybody else? But the reality is, you need to know about you and what you want to get out. How are you going to make the transition? I mentioned starting in London with literally my pack on my back. That wasn't the best way to do that transition. I was broke for 3 years, absolutely broke. I used to go, if you know it, there's a Sainsbury's on the corner of Holborn, and I used to go there at the end of the day and get the knockdown yellow sticker sandwiches because that's all I could afford to eat. I didn't really go back home to Bristol very often because I couldn't afford the train fare. I hadn't thought about making the transition and the things that I'd need. One of the other things is about balancing your induction and doing. Now, if you've been in work, you'll be familiar with kind of a formal or informal induction process. There's an expectation you need to bed into the role and learn what's expected of you, but that's not always the case. And you can quite quickly, if there is an induction process, have loads of meetings with different people, internally, externally, read loads of stuff, and get 3 weeks in and think, yeah, but what actually am I supposed to do? Like, what is my job? What do you want from me? And that's going to come from a really good conversation with your line manager. How much induction do you want me to do versus doing? Can I get a few quick objectives and a few quick wins that I can get my teeth into? It's really a basic task. One of the great bits of advice I got here was from the old head of careers at Northampton University, who I did one of these talks for. And he said he started out in banking after doing an economics degree. And he went in, and on the first day, his boss said to him, right, there's 2 things I want you to do on your first day. Number 1, clear out the stationery cupboard. Number 2, make everybody a cup of tea. And he was furious. Mark, his name was furious. He said, I have spent 4 years doing an economics degree, and I've come in for this job to start out in the world of banking and to take my career forward. And you want me to clear out the stationery cupboard and to make everybody a cup of tea. And his boss said to him this: you're going to need to know where the tools to do your job are. Now, this is some years back, so it's before we had laptops and IT systems in the same way. So his tools were pens and paper clips and staples and internal mail envelopes and all the things that used to be in a stationery cupboard. Today, your version of this is understanding your internal network drives if you're doing that kind of work, or if you're going to nursing and you're on the ward, you know what the protocols are, where the resources are, where I can get my tools to do the job. Really important first thing to do. The second thing, making a cup of tea, his boss said, you need to know your team and you need to know them at a personal level. This isn't just about a professional relationship. You need to know where they're coming from. When you're booking leave, you need to know whether that person has kids or not. Because if they have kids, they can probably only go on leave during the school holidays. And you'll need to know that, and get to know people and build trust and dependability and all those great things about being in a team. So do your planning ahead, clear out the stationery cupboard and make the tea. You'll need to know a bit about your role. Within that broad job description, formal or informal, you'll need to understand your objectives, where you need to be at certain times, what the rhythm of the week is. You have team meetings every week. I have my team meeting on a Monday morning. It's very helpful. Not always the case. Do you have one-to-one kind of boss conversations or not? Are the things done differently? Are you part of a graduate scheme, which is very structured over a period of time, and you've got some real clear objectives? You need to understand your job. And the best way is to ask people, what's my job? You might even be picking up some legacy issues from a predecessor. Somebody who's done the job before might have set some expectations around how you work, and you might want to reset them. You'll need to build those relationships and fundamentally learn the industry. Don't stay stuck on the inside. And I often look at my inbox and go, what percentage of people outside the organization are in this inbox? Have I got the balance right between internal and external? And a lot of my work's very external, so it's a good check for me. And understand the culture. How do you do this? Well, what is culture? This is from my wonderful Harvard Business Reviews. I have read a lot of them, it's true. This is a great definition by Denise Lyon. It was quite recently done. It's the ways people in the organization behave and the attitudes and belief that inform those behaviors. this is relevant in terms of the culture of the country that they're in as much as the organization. And it could be about the founders and the principles. And it's always worth going back and seeing the history of the organization. At McKinsey, they have a book, it's the way. It's very codified. In a brand new startup, that will be completely different. They'll be inventing it as they go. But it's this, the way we do things around here, including formal, stated norms, implicit ways people work and interact. No two workplaces are the same. No two offices in one organization are the same. And this will come from history, the strategy currently, the industry. So different industries have different cultures, locality, so where you are, the hierarchy in the organization, the current leadership, maybe a bit about the architecture, the buildings themselves, how they interact. There's a famous story about Conservative Party HQ, which is not too far from UCL, down in Westminster. And when they knocked all the walls down, it changed the culture of the organization. Open plan offices have a different culture to lots of small offices. Working hybrid, working from home has created different cultures, and I'm not sure we're catching up to them. But here are some of the questions you might want to ask. And think about this where you are now, whether you're still at UCL or whether you're in a different organization, or if you've been in several, if you've done some work experience, if you're mid-career and you've been in lots of places. What are the contrasts? What's valued? Is it individual initiative or working as a team? How are people congratulated in the weekly newsletter? Are decisions made in formal meetings? I started off in the civil service. Everything had to be super risk managed, big formal meetings, PowerPoint presentations, critical paths, Gantt charts, or casual chats. Go into any creative agency and you'll find people just kind of making stuff up. And that's how they find the gold in the work that they're trying to deliver. Is the office like a house party or a doctor's waiting room? If it's a GP surgery, it should feel like a doctor's waiting room. There's a reason for that calm and order. But if you were an events company, you want it to be both calm and ordered and structured, but maybe you want to feel quite like a party. And again, think about those adjectives we talked about earlier, the things you respect and you want to see and how these would play out with these questions. Are there professional standards, as there are doctors, teachers, lawyers, all the rest of them, professional standards, health and safety at work, all of these kind of things matter? Or is there a lack of them, quite a deliberate lack of them, as you'd find in some, a difference between working on a building site and maybe working in the architecture's office? Where does the money come from and how is it spent is really important as well. Not just are you in a charity or are you in a high growth marketing business to business kind of company, but how is it spent? How do people use that money? What's your expenses policy? Because culture isn't beanbags, it's not football tables, and it's certainly not written down. It's how people interact. It's the way things get done around here. And this is a load more questions. This is another Harvard Business Review article, which you need to start asking yourself. Do you thrive in a collaborative or a competitive work environment? What have you enjoyed so far? Do you like lots of flexibility? There's a big debate around hybrid working. I'll mention this in a minute, that you need to get yourself into. Do you like working on a real variety of projects all at once or focusing on a very specific thing? A friend of mine worked on the COVID vaccine, on the secondary effects, and day after day was, pipettes and test tubes and trying to find out whether something worked or something didn't work. It was very repetitive work, but she likes that. His first job was a shelf stacker at Tesco. He adored that as well. So there's a kind of continuity there, oddly. But do you like days to feel quite different? And again, if those of you put down freedom in those descriptions, what does freedom look like to you? Is it stability, predictability, or is it adventure and variety? Because here's the thing that we say in the book: the best moments in your career will be where you find a match between your personal beliefs and the values of the workplace you're in. And often the worst will be where there's a startling disconnect between the two. So that's culture. And some of this plays out in terms of the practical tools you have. I did a big review of contracts. I've done a whole presentation just on contracts. And this is broadly mine, actually. And something we get given at the start of a job, and in that peak of expectations, don't always think through. This is a really important thing. It's a legally binding document. There are things you have to comply with here, and you need to be aware of what's going on. But you should at least expect to know what your job title is and a basic description of your job. You should know what you're being paid and any other benefits and maybe bonuses you'll get in A lot of companies, you'll get equity as well. So you'll have a share in the business, long-term value, but that might only be available after a certain period of time and sometimes in return for things that you do as well. You should know about the hours and location of your work. In fact, when you've been through a university environment, you kind of got deadlines to hit, but it doesn't really matter how you get there. But actually, most jobs will have kind of core hours. You're expected to be working at certain times, and location, although again, that's changing a huge amount. They'll often say this. This is directly lifted from my contract. Although you'll be expected to work such additional hours without additional remuneration as are reasonably necessary to perform your duties properly. Essentially, there's a clause in most employment contracts to say, well, you can kind of forget about this every now and again if the job needs it. So again, think about your work-life balance. How are you having that early conversation? Holidays and leave, and what the process is for doing that. Data protection, confidential information. I've had to sign a few confidentiality clauses, maybe a bit about equipment use, and any restrictive clauses. Most people don't know about this, actually. It's often the case. So if you're from kind of creative background, maybe you're a graphic designer or even you're a speechwriter, it will often say in your contract, this belongs to the company, not to you. It will often say in a competitive environment, you'll build up your roster of clients, maybe you're in sales. It'll often say, when you leave this company, you cannot contact any of them for 6 months, maybe even a year. And so your value to your next business really changes. You can't just say, oh, I was at a great contact with this guy at Lidl, I'm going to get him for the new company. You could be taken to court for that. So don't underestimate the importance of a contract. Question in from Jacob. What would you suggest if after you start working for a company, you realize the culture doesn't align to your values? Really, really good point. Firstly, I'd say there's microcultures. So spend a bit of time working out where that culture is coming from. Are you working in a company, if you're particularly concerned about the environment and climate, and we all should be, and you find out that the fashion label you're working for illegally dumps chemicals in rivers and streams. You should have a good opportunity to find out, is that just a one-off? Have I uncovered something really ugly that needs addressing because that team doesn't take it very seriously, or is it something more rife? A friend of mine stopped working for one of the big accountancy firms because he was concerned about waste paper baskets. He thought it was ridiculous that we had waste paper baskets in every office and we should have a recycling scheme instead and put some big bins in the corner. It was overturned by an employee committee, and he just thought, this place really isn't for me. So find out what's actually going on here. Is it a bigger example of a cultural challenge, or is it one specific to this team, to this job, to this role, to maybe even to this individual? But if it's wider across the organization, you've got two choices, or three. You either kind of tolerate it, which you may or may not want to do. Secondly, you can call it out, and often there are things like whistleblowing policies, anti-corruption policies within workplaces, and you can address that through formal or informal means, a chat with your manager or with the HR department. Or ultimately, you might want to vote with your feet, like this friend of mine, and think this place just doesn't match me. But don't get burnt again. Remember to ask those critical questions. Hopefully, that's a useful answer to your question. Thank you very much for asking it. Really good point. Check your contracts, see if it aligns with your values, if things that you're happy with. And also, there's always point for negotiation. We'll come on to that in a minute. There's loads of policies in a workplace. Core hours I've mentioned, how you book leave I've mentioned, codes of conduct, often they're increasing how you behave, sometimes outside of work as well. You might have a timesheet policy, vitally important equality and diversity policies, and you'll want to see one of those in your workplace and to be put into action. CSR, corporate social responsibility, health and safety at work, really important. What do you do about these? Well, in that kind of first week, I'd really recommend doing these three things. Find out what you need to know, talk to your manager, talk to your peers, talk to other people around you in the team. What's the critical information? What do I need to know to do my job is a wonderful question to ask over and over again. Keep a note each day, so all the things that are happening around you. Good thing to do that during the course of the day and then review it every morning or every evening and just sort of take stock. What did I learn today? Because you'll be barraged by information. And you might have an employee handbook, you might have a chat with HR in your induction, you might be setting up your own business and you'll be getting some business support from Prince's Trust do this really well, and quite a few other agencies and organizations for self-employment. You'll need to know that. So have as many conversations as possible and take notes of what's going on. You won't keep it all in your head. And then I genuinely have a file in my inbox it genuinely says this when I start a new job. It says, this looks important, but I don't know what to do with it yet. And I build up that file, and I find over the next few weeks and months, I'm filtering through that and going, I get it. That's really relevant. I should have thought about that. Or actually, that was just about sandwiches in the canteen on a Wednesday, and I really don't need to know about that, so I'll delete it. But when you've got this huge amount of information, ask loads of questions, keep a note, and keep that kind of store as you go. Last couple of bits I wanted to talk about. I'm conscious I've spoken for ages, and I hope this has been useful kind of food for thought, but I want to make sure I keep kind of as much brevity in these points. So sorry for the whistle-stop tour. Is this point around money? What's the reality of a starting salary? This is data from, I updated this recently, the most recent data. This is for graduates and non-graduates. The reality is, if you're kind of, maybe you've graduated, I think the most recent average salary for an employed graduate is 35,000 a year, I saw recently. Now, remember, that's some guys going into banking in the city and getting six figures, as well as somebody just getting some temporary or kind of gig work in between. So it's only a snapshot. It doesn't mean any kind of guarantee. But roughly for all people aged, say, 22 to 29, it's about £521 a week. Now, I certainly would have thought that was a lot when I was at university, but we all know, especially with the increasing cost of living, that it goes quickly. So first thing to do is work out the reality of a starting salary for you. And you've probably done this in your budgeting anyway, but this is something you need to bear in mind as you start out in work, because there are expenses to work, not quite as much as they used to be with commuting, and often you'll get the equipment you need provided, but it isn't necessarily going to be exactly what you need. Find out what you need to know about tax and costs. Tax is often a surprise to people starting out in work. Pension contributions, always worth doing them if you can. It might seem like a long way away when you're at the start of your career, but it certainly adds up over time, and you can forget to do it later. But think about what you need to know about tax and costs depending on the work you're doing. And that'll be very different if you're self-employed or if you're working on contracts than it would be if you're in full-time permanent employment. Set a realistic budget and plan ahead seems obvious, but one of the other things that people are often shocked by when they're starting out is you often get paid monthly when you go into your first full-time permanent job. And there's a gap of 4 weeks between day one and when that paycheck comes in. And I've seen a lot of people come a bit unstuck about that, especially when they're starting a new job and you need to put a deposit down on your rent and you need to buy a new suit, really adds up. And so really think about your budget and how it plays out. Track that budget and make informed decisions. Seems really obvious, but making sure you've got enough contingency and you're keeping on top of your budgeting is hugely important. And the last one, and there's another great book, I think it's called Money, helpfully. Think about what it means to you. My background and starting out from quite sort of low incomes and not having that extravagant lifestyle at all, money was something that has always overshadowed a lot of my career decisions. I've often thought, how much do I need to live, and can I get by on this, and been worried about being made redundant because that's how I grew up. And that's what those values were. Others, the entrepreneurs I know, will look at how they can bring in other people's money and spend it and make it fast and develop it quickly and gamble all the rest of it on the next big idea. And that's a lot to do with what money means to you. So spend some time thinking through what your drivers are and what makes you comfortable. And I was speaking on a panel recently with a brilliant organization, which was about money and mental health. And just to make a big flag up here for the link between your mental health and your well-being, and how money and work interacts with those as well, and making sure you're making the right decisions for you. You don't need to always go chasing more and more money. In fact, that can drive pressures elsewhere. Similarly, you'll need to have enough to meet your expectations of how you want to live, and there can be big shortfalls there too. So worth having a look at that. Money Advice Service, absolutely brilliant. Citizens Advice right there, and they do similar stuff as well. But let's get into this question of how you negotiate a better job offer. This is from a Harvard professor. I promise not all my stuff's from Harvard, but it just happens to be today. And here's how they say you should negotiate a pay rise. Firstly, don't underestimate the importance of likability. One of the things that this professor says, I think it's brilliant actually, is when somebody's offered you a job, they've fallen in love with you. They've gone out to the world and they've cast around for all the potential people who could do this job. They've shortlisted probably 10, 20. They have spoken to at least 6 in round 1 and at least 3 in round 2. And you are the one they have chosen, and they're in love with you. And you're in a wonderful period to be able to get the kind of setup that you want in a job. So I certainly felt absolutely relieved to get any job at all. I'd completely forgotten this point and didn't dawn on me until much later. Second thing he says is think through the whole offer. You're in a great position, but don't just go for the sake of it for a pay rise, as helpful as that can be. Think through, what kind of flexibility do I want? You know, have I got other responsibilities, caring responsibilities I need to meet? Do I still have a lust for traveling the world? And do I want to build that in as well? So what's the whole settlement? And also remember, you're there at least 9 to 5, possibly more. Are you going to enjoy working in that place and in that culture? And then we'll finish this and I'll go back to a few more of these questions. Understand the person across the table. A lot of people have negotiated pay and terms with me at very different times. I've usually got a budget envelope. There's probably so far I can do. There's some flexibility I can give you. You can't expect the person who's making the decision to have all of the flexibility in the world to meet your needs. So they're also possibly a bit worried. You know, if I do give you compressed hours where you work fewer days over a longer period of time, am I genuinely going to get the kind of service that I want for all of my team? Do I need to have people in the office a bit more? Big debate around that at the moment. So understand where that person's coming from. Pull everything together and negotiate it all at the same time is a really good tip. Don't sort of go, I'd like 20 grand more, and then go back the next day and say, oh, and I'd also like to work 4 days a week. Get the opportunity is to have the conversation about the full offer. Be prepared for tough questions as well. Often these decisions don't come lightly. So how does this need to be done in practice? When do you want these things to be given? Can we not give you a bonus instead of a pay rise? Because bonuses are a lot easier for businesses. They're not a long-term commitment. Can we give you flexibility instead of additional money? Run through all the potential questions they might ask and make sure that you've got a really robust and kind and thought through answer to it. And the last bit is just maintain a bit of perspective. You may be able to move this a little bit, but it might not meet all of your needs. And I think it's a really nice process to sort of think through from the great position you're in, to have that conversation, to set some parameters and maybe just get a bit more and be a bit more valued in the work that you do. I'll take a couple of questions just before I go on to my final bit, and then we can go to the wider questions. To what extent should you try and change the culture if it's a bit toxic? So in schools where the leadership and attitudes among staff are poor, that can happen. I've been a school governor before, and not in the interest of young people. How much do you try and work against that or leave? And then what of the people left there getting a raw deal? I think so. The school's a really interesting example because, of course, in most workplaces, for the most part, this isn't always true. You tend to have the opportunity to leave if it's not working for you. One of the things I'd say there is, you know, look at the structures within that organization to make sure that there is a high quality culture in there as well. I mentioned I was a governor. How do you make representation to the governors who are responsible for that, to the leadership of the organization? But if the leadership doesn't feel right, then that can be a real challenge. And sometimes boards and governors and trustees can be quite complicit in toxic cultures. Second thing I'd say is kind of understand where that's coming from, where those attitudes are there and the impact that it's having. It's one of my things I've always found in work, and I don't know if others have seen this as well, is that if you're thinking it, it's probably the case that other people are as well, but they might not be voicing it. They might not be voicing it because we've all got a level of self-interest. And so I think when you can have some, gentle, thoughtful conversations with other people about what you're not comfortable about, either formal or informal ones, so the conversation with HR or with your colleagues, maybe just calling it out starts a bit of a different kind of conversation. And then the last thing, I think this is really critically important, especially in education settings, but there's a line between there's just a bit of a slapdash or an aggressive or an unpleasant culture, and one where there's genuine safeguarding concerns. And that obviously is a whole different category, where there are worries that actually those young people might be significantly disadvantaged or in some cases at risk. Then this has to be something that's delivered very openly and very much with the people who need to hear it, not more broadly. Give that feedback. I visited an early years setting recently, and there were a few things I just wasn't happy about. I had no connection to that earlier setting at all, but I wrote to the school secretary and I said, here are 3 things I saw I'm not happy about. And I'm not going to take it any further, but your management team needs to have that conversation. So be bold, call it out, put it in the forum that should be dealing with it, and you'll find that often people around you agree. I know that's not perfect advice. This is a difficult situation, but that's how I would approach it. Loyalty, next question, was about trying to stay in one job for at least a couple of years, but come to know many colleagues jump from one job to another. Do they still value loyalty? I think there's a range of opinion out there. I think loyalty really matters. I think you can do a really good maternity cover and move on to something else and be considered very loyal. I've really enjoyed the maternity covers that I've done. And I think that the loyalty to me means, being reliable, that I can depend upon you, that you deliver really high quality work on time, that you think broader than just the day job and you're thinking, how can I help others, that you're kind to others, you create an inclusive, supportive environment. So I think it's not just about length of time, but how you do that job. I think there is a greater expectations that people move around. There's some quite good data which shows that it benefits you to stay in an organization in terms of pay and benefits more than it does to move from one organization to another. So if you get an offer of a bit of a pay hike somewhere else, do take a bit of trepidation with it and maybe go back to that negotiating a pay rise and say, look, I really think I'm worth more than this. And actually, maybe you'll get more from the job that you're in than elsewhere. I think attitudes to work have changed, and I think there is an expectation of greater turnover at the moment. So maybe that idea of loyalty has changed. One of the things I've always found is it feels very intense when you're in a role, but often when you leave it, it dissipates quite quickly. You stay in touch with a few people, you reflect on your experiences better. It's not quite as intense as when you're in there. And also, I'm really I've had the lovely experience of a few people coming back and working for me again. That's absolutely the most gorgeous loyalty, a wonderful gift to have from somebody thinking, well, I was there before, and I'd love to do that again. So loyalty, I think, can mean lots of different things, and it's certainly changing. Then in terms of how much salary to negotiate for, asking for too much and settling for less, I think that's a really interesting one. How do you benchmark? Well, firstly, all companies are benchmarking. I don't think that's the best way to start, set a salary, but there you go. It's just my view. I think there's something that happens where you can look on other similar sounding jobs. You mentioned Glassdoor is quite a good one, but you just go and search the internet as well. And I do a bit of this when I'm creating a new role. Look at the job descriptions a bit, what's expected of you. Most salaries are scored, so you'll get points for and more money for management responsibility or length of experience or so on. Again, don't necessarily agree with this, but it's how it's done. But look at what the value is and reflect on what you think your personal value is as well. So that can be quite different in terms of your attitudes to money, but you might want to think, okay, well, a senior usually is about 10% more than a manager, and and I expect an assistant to be lower, but equally I'd want to have a really good learning and development package built in with that, so I can get quite quickly to the next level. So thinking the round, a benchmark against what you see others getting is quite helpful, because that's what they're doing, but also layer on your own worth alongside that as well. And then in terms of sort of job value as well, how much you should be earning is really variable. It's changing a huge amount at the moment, and it's the same for when you're pitching for work as you're kind of if you're independently employed or kind of a freelancer. Maybe at the start you kind of pitch it a bit lower because you're asking people to take a risk on you. Maybe over time, when you've got a really big body of work and you're respected and it's starting to come to you rather than you're going out to get to it, maybe you can start to do a bit less and charge a bit more. There's a lovely book called Company of One, which is about a guy who said, I'm not going to grow my business. I'm just going to select some very high value, really exciting projects, and I'm just going to work for myself as one person in a company forever. Really fascinating book, really well worth a read. So hard answer, but benchmark and think through what you think would make really rich and rewarding work. And then the last one, and then I'll finish up. How to raise the issue of the gender pay gap. Still a huge problem about starting a new job. There's a good comment on Twitter I saw the other day where somebody said, next time I do a mortgage application and they say, what's your salary? I'm going to write competitive. Obviously, everybody should be showing the salary from the outset. There is a massive equity problem with this. There's a employer's argument, which I kind of get, which is about, you should have a bit of flexibility to bring in talent and so on. But really, there shouldn't be a gender pay gap in an organization. There's statutory reporting. It's a really good cultural sign if you see voluntary gender pay gap reporting for organizations that don't have to, and to see the approach they're taking to it. And I think raising the issue of the gender pay gap is quite a good one to ask outside of the organization, maybe not in specifics, but perhaps in general. And so what progress are you making on equalizing pay between genders within the organization? I think that would be a hell of a question to ask. And I think you'll learn a lot about an organization that answers that well, as opposed to one that answers it badly. Lots of really good work done by the Fawcett Society, by the Equality and Human Rights Commission on this, but still, as we all know, an incredibly long way to go. And I think the best way is to be honest and open and say that it matters to you. And it should really matter to these companies too. They're missing out on extraordinary amounts of talent. Last one then, recruitment training suggests that decisions should be purely based on whether the person meets the essential and desirable criteria, not on anything else. Such as first impressions, how people are dressed, punctuality. You're so right. I think there's a bit we talk about in the book. There's a book called Biased, which is a US book about bias within recruitment processes and how it particularly affects Black candidates. It's horrific. People change their names on CVs and they see different results. Again, absolutely ridiculous. One of the things I've started to do in an attempt, an honest go at trying to make these things a bit better, is I always send out, I think I've been doing this pretty routinely with my team, certainly did it in the most recent recruit, send out interview questions in advance. You get much better responses. I'm not testing whether you can think on your feet. I'm testing whether you can do the job. I think there are quite a few kind of new platforms which try and remove bias in recruiting. Recruiters are increasingly doing this more. I think that's hugely important. The essential and desirable criteria, absolutely, after an interview, if you didn't get it, ask for feedback and ask it on the basis of, on that, where did I meet and not meet the essential and desirable criteria for the role, rather than impressions. That's really helpful. You give you things that you need to learn, were you to do that again. Maybe you need a bit more experience in managing stakeholders or contracts or finance. That's fine. You can learn that stuff. That's actionable. But there still is a huge bias problem. Diverse panels really matter, and always look for that statement of how reasonable adjustments will be made for disabled candidates, how they're trying to remove bias in recruitment practices. This will again tell you a huge amount about the organisation. Last little bits then. I think this is relevant to a lot of what we were just talking about. Remember that the decision about you getting into or keeping you in the organisation is the one forefront of mind about making salary decisions, about making flexible working arrangements. They want to keep you in the organisation. It's incredibly expensive to recruit new people compared to retaining them. So use it as a tool for demonstrating your value to the business. If you're showing enthusiasm and productivity and you're delivering against what is expected of you, you're doing it in that wonderfully warm and kind way, they're always going to be a bit more flexible than perhaps you realize. I wish I'd known that earlier. Tiny last little bit, because I did promise I'd talk about what to wear for a Zoom interview. Something's changed massively and we're still learning about hybrid working. How do you navigate it? Here are some of the things I've learned kind of running teams, talking to others, and being in a hybrid environment myself, as we are today. Regularly check in on how you're doing. Have that conversation and ask that question of your boss or your colleague or the person you're having a random cup of coffee with online. How am I doing? Try and seek a lot of feedback. Talk about it in the book and in one of my other seminars about how to get feedback that builds your confidence as well. Ask lots of questions and ask more. Put them in chats during meetings. Make sure you have lots of follow-up conversations. If there's a complex meeting you're in, try and schedule with the relevant person a quick conversation afterwards. Did I get this right? People want to know more that you are engaged and interested in learning and trying to do a good job than they are worried that you don't know what you're doing. So always ask the question, show your work, give people draft versions of things. It's much better to do that. Organize your personal environment around you. That will really help with your mental health as well. Make sure you've got a clean environment that you're working with as far as possible. I'm conscious with a family, a house that I'm in, that's not always possible. Sometimes it's a work meeting shared with somebody eating their Cocoa Pops on the kitchen table. That's just part of how this works. Be clear when you're available, keep your calendars up to date and tell people when you're about and when you're not. Plan your time, create a bit of informal time as well that you'd normally have in the office, having a bit of a general chat, agendaless meetings, maybe a quick catch up. Make sure you meet people outside of your team as well. It's very tempting to lose all of those corridor conversations and to get stuck in just a set of relationships, whereas the more you can reach out to others, the better, and make a lot of time for learning and thinking. And I think that's just as important to put in your diary as your team meeting, as your client meeting, and as anything else. Always really prioritize you, your well-being, and your learning in your role. As a podcast, you can go and have a look at that. There's a season we put up. I need to do some more. And we have a couple of social channels you can find out a bit more. And as I say, Steve Haines 101 on LinkedIn. Ask me any other questions.